Hey there, everyone. I am going to devote this entire session to talking about the Little Smith propane oxygen torch. I will talk through setting it up, turning it on and off, as well as bleeding the hose at the end of your workday. I will also discuss your fuel options, as well as the different tanks that you can invest in. The picture shown is the setup that I have in my personal studio. On the left, the green tank is a pressurized oxygen tank, and on the right, the white tank is propane. What's missing in this photo are the very important flashback arresters, but I will go into that detail later. I chose to go with propane because it's easier to look at and it's cleaner to breathe, and my insurance does cover it. Some insurance companies only allow the use of acetylene since if it leaks, propane sinks to the floor. Whichever you choose to go with, just be sure to secure them either in a basket like this or bungee cord them to the leg of your workbench. This is an oxygen tank. It's an oxygen storage vessel, which is held under pressure in gas cylinders, and it's referred in the industry as high pressure oxygen cylinder. These can be purchased or rented. If purchased, when empty, you can switch them out at your local welding supply. With the pressurized tank, you will need an appropriate oxygen regulator. You will also need an oxygen flashback arrestor. Flashback arresters are absolutely essential. They're basically a shutoff valve. They have an inline check valve, preventing a hose fire from reaching the regulators or the tank. They're sold in pairs, but depending on your setup, you may need only one or the other. There are two types of flashback arresters for the Little Smith. One is a torch mount, and the other is a regulator mount. I personally prefer the torch mount. You may choose instead to go with a disposable oxygen tank, in which case you will not need the flashback arrestor. I personally don't recommend these tanks because they run out really quickly and they don't recycle. But you will need a disposable tank oxygen regulator. With this, there are no gauges. It's just a knob on top that adjusts the pressure. Or you can make an investment and eliminate the tanks altogether by getting an oxygen concentrator. One benefit is that it eliminates the safety issues associated with high-pressure oxygen tanks. You don't need a regulator. You don't need a flashback arrestor. You simply attach your hoses and then plug it in, and then it draws air from your environment. The only challenge with it is that it might be loud. As for fuel, I have this 5-pound propane tank. When it's empty, I take it to Ace Hardware or to the gas station to have it refilled for a mere $3 or $5. You might also choose to go with a 20-pound tank. Either way, you'll need a regulator. This can also be used for acetylene, and a flashback arrestor. Another option is to use a disposable propane tank. These two, when they're empty, they cannot be recycled or refilled. And you'll need an appropriate regulator. Okay, and so then you also have the option of using acetylene instead of propane, in which case your system would look like this. You've got your oxygen tank, acetylene tank, regulators, flashback arresters, and then the hoses. You may also decide that you want to run 2 torches off of one tank system, in which case you'll need these 2 hose Ys or splitters, one for oxygen, one for propane. These are ideal for instructors who want to teach 2 students with 2 different torches but don't want to invest in a whole nother tank setup. If you choose to go with my system, this is what it's going to look like. You've got your pressurized oxygen tank and a 5-gallon propane tank, regulators, flashback arresters, and then I use the splitters because I teach, and then the hoses. Don't worry, stay tuned and I'll show you how to set the pressure and run your torches. You can get this Safe Detect leak detector from Rio Grande that is included with a cotton swab, or you can make your own. All you need is non-oil-based soap and water and a cotton swab. And while your hoses are turned on, you run the solution all the way down the hoses and along the joints. You will see very obvious bubbles if there's a leak. Now let's talk about torch tips. For an oxygen propane setup, you will need number 6 and number 7. If you use anything smaller, you'll find that your torch will blow itself out. If you're using an acetylene and oxygen setup, you'll use numbers 2 through 5. But generally, you will not use numbers 6 and 7. You can see the number marked clearly on each tip. Turn your tanks on, and then you're going to adjust the pressure. Open your tank, turn the oxygen on the tip, and if you're using a 6 tip, adjust your oxygen to 6. If you're using a number 7 tip, adjust your pressure to 7. Open your propane tank, light the torch, and adjust it to 6 or 7, depending on which tip you're using. Okay, now to turn on the torches. I have color-coded poop at every one of my stations. P, red, is propane. Green, O, is oxygen. To turn your torch on, you'll start with the red, propane, and then you'll add green, oxygen. So here I've turned it on. I've lit it with red, propane. Now I'm going to add the green, oxygen, and that's going to feed the fuel. And then to turn it off, you'll first turn off the green, righty-tighty, so it's going to the right. Turn off the green, the oxygen, and then turn off the red, propane. With the Little Smith, I'm pretty militant about the flame. So I'm going to go over this slowly. Light the propane, red. Add your oxygen, green. And what I focus on is that smaller inner cone, not the exterior cone, the smaller inner one. I'll show you with my pick. It's a little hard to see it on this YouTube video, but what I see is a light blue, slightly rounded tip. If you have too much oxygen, that little cone inside will become sharp and slightly lavender. And what that will result in is you're burning off your flux before your solder has a chance to flow. Your piece will oxidize and your solder will not flow. So here it's too much oxygen. You can see it's become pointy, sharp. It's hard to see the color, unfortunately. What we're looking at now is a sharp, slightly lavender, unfortunately, you can't see that color, tip that has too much oxygen. So now I'm turning down my oxygen, and you can barely see, it's a very subtle shift. That inner cone is becoming more rounded, and it's a lighter blue. The alternative is that you might have too much propane, in which case you're simply not going to get your piece hot enough. And that inner flame is going to have a loose or a bushy tip. This here is a annealing flame. That's still too bushy. And now it's getting to a point where it's nice and rounded. To turn it up, you want to add propane and then oxygen. To turn it up again, propane, oxygen. To turn it down, oxygen, propane. To turn it down again, turn down to the left, your oxygen and your propane. And then to turn it off, oxygen, propane. I encourage you to play around with that flame, but if you're having difficulty, please comment below and I can walk you through it. One other point is that I noticed that a lot of people hold their torches really far from their silver. So this is how far. I always hold my torch right up against the silver so that it's pretty much butting up against that internal flame. Not that far. I go that far. You also don't want to be in the torch, otherwise you'll get dirt inside your torch, and then the flame will turn yellow. Even with an annealing flame, which is what this is, I always have my torch held close to my piece at that inner flame. Then, at the end of the day, you'll turn off your oxygen, you'll turn off your propane, You'll turn your regulators off. I have to close my Y splitters, turning your regulators off, and then you'll bleed your hoses. To bleed your hoses, I always turn on my oxygen until it runs out, and then I light my propane so that I can literally watch the flame go down, and then I don't have to smell the propane. And with the pressurized tanks, as long as you have those flashback arresters, then you can set your torch aside and feel safe until you come back the next day. I hope this helped. Let me know if you have any questions.